Hi. So Joe Biden's going to be sworn in 2 days as the 46th President of the United States. Kamala Harris as the historic Vice President. Historic, of course, being the first woman. Um, this is notable for a number of reasons. Firstly, Biden's the oldest president ever, only the second Catholic in office. And of course, Harris being the first female vice president makes that swearing in a bit more significant than usual. Um, and the first vice president, who's a visible ethnic minority. Um, I believe back in the 1930s, and I may get this slightly wrong, but I believe Calvin Coolidge's vice president, Charles Curtis, was of Native American descent, so he may have technically been the first ethnic minority president. Um, but vice president. Um, I've spoken a lot recently about the events on Capitol Hill and Donald Trump and a lot of the issues around that. And I stand by everything I say. I think it's an abomination, the sort of cult-like behavior that goes on around Donald Trump, hardcore Donald Trump supporters. I think Donald Trump's a disgrace to his office. I really do. I think whatever achievements he's had in his 4 years, and he has had some. I mean, probably the most notable is diplomacy in the Middle East. It's probably the most notable, getting Israel and neighbors to uh, sign um, pacts, for want of a better term, or alliances, treaties. Um, I'm not putting a precise tag on that because I think often these things, it takes time to pan out to see how they develop. But I do think, to be fair to Trump, that's probably one of the better aspects of his presidency. It's difficult to find much else. He stood up to China. Um, that warrants respect, but I still say that's been inconsistent. He favoured the weaker concentration camps, or at least he was purported to say they sounded like a good idea. I don't think Trump particularly cares about human rights. I think his whole thing with China is more to do with trade, but if that means also getting tougher rhetoric, that's not a bad thing. His handling of coronavirus, I think, has been pretty awful. Um, but anyway, that's maybe for another video, the assessment of Trump's legacy. This video, I want to focus on the other side. I want to focus on the incoming administration and the direction of politics it might go down. It's often said that Joe Biden's a moderate, but I think he is definitely on the left. I think he would be one of the most liberal presidents ever. I think even surpassing Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama in that sense, because partly of the politics of the day. When Obama came into office in 2008, I don't think America was as bitterly divided as it is now. Whilst the cultural wars have been going on for decades, they're not a new thing. They've been going on probably since the 80s. There's always been a left-right paradigm, but in terms of the modern sense of the word, I'd say it's been going on probably since the 80s or the 90s. Um, Certainly with the rise of social media, I think that definitely galvanized it. So the environment of 2020 is different to 2008. Um, Back in 2008, the big issue was the global recession and the ongoing war in Iraq. Um, Now, at that time, domestic issues I don't think was as big. I mean, domestic social issues weren't as big as they are now. With Biden and Harris, they're often portrayed as moderates to centrist. Certainly, Biden is. Harris, on some level, she was a prosecutor in California, um, with a controversial record, it has to be said. But here's the thing: it's irrefutable that the hard left now has a big influence on the Democratic Party. And I think some analogies here with Britain's Labour Party and the influence of the Corbyn faction and others, momentum. So what momentum is to the British Labour Party, I think that is on some level to what Antifa and Black Lives Matter and so on is to the American Democratic Party. That's not exactly the same thing because Labour switched more to the centre with the election of Starmer last year. But, for me, Starmer still needs to really prove that he will be on the side of common sense over woke ideology. I was very disappointed when he took the knee. I thought that's a ridiculous gesture. Um, it would be different if he'd said, we need to listen to the black community and listen to concerns that they have. But to me, that was ridiculous. It was political tokenism, and that didn't go down very well in my mind. But anyway, there is speculation that the hard left is going to kind of have Biden as a puppet. During the debate, he said in fiery exchanges with Trump, "I am the Democratic Party today." Um, people voted for me over Bernie Sanders, which is true. So I think there's definitely a moderate faction there, but this is kind of a difficult position Biden's in a sense, because he knows that the left of the party, former Bernie supporters, Black Lives Matter activists, and so on, have helped got him the nomination and actually the presidency. So he can't totally just dismiss them and ignore them because that would mean the internal party mechanisms would then get into sort of civil war, which wouldn't be good, you know, for a first term, um, or Biden's first term. They want to show united front. Um, but I am definitely concerned about some of the rhetoric coming from Biden and Harris. Definitely pandering to identity politics and woke ideology. When the events were going on at Capitol Hill, I was as shocked and outraged as anyone else, but anyone with common sense, that is. But already Biden was starting to play the race narrative. He was saying if this was a group of Black Lives Matter activists, it would be very different. In fact, he quoted his daughter as saying that. Um, it's possible that that's true, but that insinuates that BLM is peaceful and there's absolutely no problem with the left. One of my biggest contentions about the current situation is both sides are as guilty as one another for trying to downplay the extremes and the violence on their side. So it is true that in the last few weeks, Trump supporters and too many conservatives have tried to downplay what happened. A lot has to be said, a lot of Republicans condemned it. And they were immediately accused of trivializing it, which I think they were if they were trying to downplay it. However, I don't think it's whataboutery to point out the hypocrisy of Democrats who denounce this. I was looking over some old archives, well, archives from last year, because I follow the news very closely. I've got newspapers. I even take pictures of the news, partly to help me with these videos. And I remember Guardian headline from last year saying William Barr causes controversy by accusing protesters of sedition. Now, this was in the wake of last summer's violence. Why is that controversial yet when Biden and Harris call the events at Capitol Hill sedition? That's different. Is it because of the optics? Because one was on the streets of, you know, um, provincial cities as opposed to being in the national capital? Um, is it because the events that happened the other day directly hit legislators? They were right on the front line of it. Whereas Biden and Harris and other Democratic politicians weren't the ones who were seeing their businesses burned down and looted and so on. I always make the caveat Biden has clearly condemned that, and he said that rioters should be prosecuted. And I don't know if Harris has or not. I assume she has. Biden said that she has. I'd be surprised if she didn't. However, it is irrefutable that senior Democrats were encouraging protest. They weren't encouraging violence necessarily, but they were saying things that you need to get in the face of Trump enablers. Um, you need to take to the streets. Nancy Pelosi said, I'm surprised there aren't uprisings all over the country. So I do think it is rank hypocrisy the Democrats to kind of be playing this game whereby, oh, let's all have responsible language when they were fueling the flames last year. They very clearly were. And I'm an outsider, but I see similar hypocrisies in Britain because a lot of this spilled over to this island. Black Lives Matter is very active here. And, we had significant unrest ourselves last year. Not to the extent of 30 deaths, but, you know, there was trouble and there was violence and there was vandalism. It was serious enough. Um, and there was bitter debates over these issues. But, when the Democrats push things like critical race theory, to me, they are just driving the wedges of division. Absolutely. It's one of the things I most dislike about the left, how they pander to and fuel the victimhood narrative. And then if anyone challenges it, they're immediately denounced as a bigot or a white supremacist. Um, I abhor white supremacists. I think they are what they are. They're white supremacists. They're a despicable ideology, but as is any racial supremacy. Um, so I'm not convinced that the next 4 years are going to be calm. I do think that Biden's a far more adult politician than Trump. I think that he will at least set the right tones. Well, broadly speaking, again, I can't say that's been consistent. Biden, in his victory speech, was very careful not to attack Trump, and he said we need to come together. I call on those who didn't support me, etc. He was being statesmanlike and presidential. However, one also has to look at him then pandering to the identity politics. That to me is not presidential. That is stoking the flames. Um, so I really think Biden and Harris, when they get into office, in order to cool the temperature, they need to distance themselves from the hard left, and they need to condemn extremism in all its forms. If Black Lives Matter gets more militant, and there are some signs that that's happening, um, they need to denounce that. It's all very well denouncing white supremacists and extreme Trump supporters. That's fine. I think they should, but they need to be consistent because I think the most toxic thing in American discourse right now, and to some extent British discourse, is the perception of double standards. And I don't think either side really grasp it. Hardcore Trump supporters are in total denial about what happened the other day. But also, I think the left is in denial that they also have some ugly elements. Antifa, in my opinion, are a bunch of thugs. Simply putting Antifa in front of your, you know, name as a label to give yourself some sort of moral credence. Put it this way, Joseph Stalin was arguably the biggest anti-fascist in history, but he killed millions of people. So I think it's a grotesque distortion to say that these people have moral righteousness just because they call themselves anti-fascists. The real anti-fascists were resistance fighters in World War II who paid with their lives, took great personal risks in France and in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic. Um, you know, young RAF pilots who paid with their lives. They were the real anti-fascists, not rioters who cover themselves in black and vandalize shops and attack political opponents. Um, as for Black Lives Matter, I still make the point that they have failed to denounce the racists in their midst. I don't believe that they're just a civil rights movement. I really don't. They may have started off that way, and I think they've probably brought about a useful debate about police power in America. That's an extremely important debate. But I think the bad news, and I struggle to see anything positive that Black Lives Matter has actually done. Of course, left-wing publications will hail them as heroes. I mean, Time Magazine and CNN and other left-wing outlets will really, really promote them. But as a serious question, you have to sit back and think, what have they actually achieved? Other than a lot of anger, a lot of unrest, and racial division set back. That's certainly the case in this country. Except in America, it's a slightly different dynamic because the racial history of Britain and America is not exactly the same. We can't just say Britain's a microcosm of the United States. It's not that simple. Um, but I would simply put it to Black Lives Matter. If you're simply a civil rights group, will you denounce someone like Yusuf Gali who demonized all white people? And when they keep pushing the white privilege narrative, imagine, right, as a scenario, you are a poor white American in Arkansas or West Virginia, and you've really suffered hardship from the Great Recession onwards, and you're white, and maybe your community is riddled with drugs, high unemployment, you name it, um, and then you hear this narrative that you're privileged. I think it's a very it's an expression I despise. I know where it comes from, the idea that white people don't face the same institutional racism, but I still think it's just a toxic phrase, and it hasn't been anywhere near challenged enough. You could be damn sure CNN will turn a blind eye to black and brown racists. So the selective reporting is part of the rot, in my opinion. So CNN really can't be any more triumphalist than the Democratic Party when it comes to the problems in America. I mean, with Donald Trump, you have an unhinged narcissist, a demagogue, a very obnoxious figure in many ways. But the problems that America faces are deeper than Trump. And I think they began before Trump. I think Trump's escalated them for sure. But so has the hard left. Now Trump's out of office, he could become some sort of renegade figure. He could maybe air his own talk show. He could become a third party figure akin to George Wallace. But the point is he will now be out of office. He's in many ways a disgraced former president, or will be in 3 days. Um, but the Democrats can't be triumphalist about this. And they'll be pushing for his trial. They are tasked with healing a divided nation, and they're not going to do that by simply parroting to the argument, all the white people are privileged. Let's pander to a black identitarian group that is getting more militant, Black Lives Matter. Um, I don't think it's going to help matters. I really don't, because what that's going to do is that's going to polarize moderate white Americans. Some of them might be quite left wing. They might have no time for Trump, but they don't want to constantly hear um, that they're all one and the same. Um, so see what happens. By the way, just as a matter of record, the idea that white people are never shot by the police, well, one of the 5 people who died was shot by the police. She was a white woman, Trump supporter. I'm not saying that that wasn't warranted. You know, he was part of a violent insurrection. She was knowing, she knew what she was getting herself into. Uh, my my real sympathy lies with the police officer who died that day. Quite honest. Um, but I just think that Democrats can't be too self-righteous, and they have to really start reflecting on the way they talk about things. Like anyone who has a slight difference of opinion, they smear as a racist. This hard left, woke intolerance. I fear that Biden and Harris aren't going to do much to combat it. If anything, they're going to pander to it. So in that sense, Biden won't be a moderate president. He will be a puppet of the hard left. In that sense, it's until he proves otherwise. I want to see Biden and Harris starting to call out the far left as well. You would expect them to denounce Trump and his extreme supporters, hardcore supporters, white supremacists, and all of that. That's fine. They should do that. But I think the true test of leadership is if they call out the extremes on their side. And anyone who thinks that the situation in America is black and white that one side is good and the other side is bad. It's deluded. There are extremes on both sides. There really are. And I want to see Biden and Harris acknowledge that and, you know, be leaders, call it out, distance themselves from it, and then start the healing process.